What if the greatest hero of faith you've ever admired wasn't as righteous as you believed? King David, yes, the same David who defeated Goliath and wrote psalms of worship, once committed a sin so devastating that it shattered his legacy and brought turmoil to his entire household. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a moral failure that began with a single glance, but ended in betrayal, death, and heartbreak. But here's what most people miss. David's fall wasn't the end. It was how he faced his darkest failure that reveals a profound truth. No one is immune to temptation, and no sin stays hidden forever. His story exposes the cost of unchecked desire and the power of genuine repentance. To truly grasp what led him down this path, we need to go back to where David's story began, long before the crown, back in the fields where a young shepherd learned what true courage really meant. David wasn't born a king, far from it. His story begins in the quiet hills of Bethlehem, where he tended his father's sheep, a role many would consider humble, ordinary even. Yet, this young shepherd displayed a courage beyond his years. Imagine facing a lion or a bear with nothing but a staff and a sling. David didn't just face them, he defeated them. His bravery wasn't about reckless strength, but a bold trust in God's power working through him. It was this same unshakable faith that led him to the battlefield, where Goliath, a Philistine giant, taunted Israel's armies. Picture the scene: a boy standing against a towering warrior, armed to the teeth. No armor, no sword, just a sling and 5 smooth stones. Yet David's confidence wasn't in his tools, but in the living God. With a single shot, he felled Goliath, not just winning a fight, but becoming a symbol of faith-driven victory. Courage often looks different from what we expect, doesn't it? Sometimes it means confronting danger head-on, like David. Other times, it's standing firm in faith when the world seems against you. Think of moments when you've faced personal giants, those overwhelming fears, financial struggles, or broken relationships. True courage comes not from what you hold, but from who holds you. David's rise from shepherd to hero teaches a vital lesson. Preparation happens in the hidden places. While the world saw a young boy, God saw a warrior being shaped in the silence of the fields. How many times do we overlook our own seasons of preparation, thinking they don't matter? Yet those quiet battles prepare us for public victories. What lions and bears are you facing today that might be strengthening your faith? His story reveals that greatness often emerges from obscurity. David wasn't chosen because of wealth, status, or appearance. In fact, when the prophet Samuel sought the next king, David wasn't even invited to the first round of selection. His father, Jesse, presented his older, stronger sons, but God had different criteria. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Think about it. How often do we judge our worth by external success? The job title, the bank account, the social approval. David reminds us that true greatness is shaped internally. Your worth isn't measured by achievements, but by the heart you cultivate in private moments of faithfulness. Yet, even after his victory over Goliath, David didn't rush to claim glory. He returned to shepherding, continuing his humble service. This reveals a truth often forgotten. Real leaders serve before they reign. How can you serve in your current role with excellence, even if it feels small? True success begins with faithfulness in the little things. But as David's story unfolds, we see how even the most courageous hearts can shift under the weight of success. Victory on the battlefield doesn't guarantee victory over the heart. And as David's influence grew, so did his vulnerabilities. David's journey to the throne wasn't instant. It was marked by seasons of patience, trials, and divine timing. After defeating Goliath, his fame spread throughout Israel, yet he didn't seize power by force. Instead, he served King Saul with loyalty, playing the harp to calm the tormented king's spirit. But fame has a way of stirring jealousy, and Saul's envy grew dangerous, even to the point of attempting to take David's life. Despite being anointed as the future king by the prophet Samuel, David refused to take shortcuts. Think about that. He had every reason to fight for the throne, yet he chose to trust God's timing completely. Imagine being promised something great, yet forced to wait while others misunderstood and mistreated you. How often do we grow impatient, trying to force outcomes instead of trusting God's perfect plan? David spent years hiding in caves, a fugitive hunted by Saul. Yet even when given the chance to kill Saul and claim the throne, he held back. In one instance, David found Saul sleeping in a cave, but chose mercy over vengeance, saying, "I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed." This restraint reveals the heart of a true leader, one who values integrity over personal gain. And isn't that a lesson we often overlook? In today's world, leadership is frequently associated with power and dominance. But David's rise shows that true authority is earned through character, not force. Whether you're leading a family, a business, or simply your own life, greatness is built through consistent faithfulness, not self-promotion. Eventually, after Saul's tragic death, David ascended the throne, becoming Israel's most celebrated king. He led with wisdom, uniting the kingdom and bringing prosperity. His Psalms reflect a man deeply connected to God, often seeking guidance and praising God for victories. But success, while a blessing, can also reveal hidden cracks in the heart. David's devotion, though genuine, began to shift subtly. Power has a way of making even the strongest hearts drift. His kingdom expanded, his influence soared, but the humility of the shepherd boy seemed to fade. And isn't that a danger we all face? When life gets comfortable, the need for dependence on God can feel less urgent, yet it's in those moments when our guard must be highest. Comfort often brings compromise. David, who once led his armies from the front, began staying behind during battles. It was during one such idle season that his most devastating failure would unfold. A single moment of complacency can alter the course of a life, reminding us that spiritual vigilance is never optional. And so, in the season of his greatest success, David found himself standing on the edge of a fall he never saw coming. Because the greater the height, the steeper the consequences. David's heart, once anchored in humility and faith, had begun to drift. While his armies were out fighting for the kingdom, he stayed behind in Jerusalem, a choice that would change his life forever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the city's skyline, David strolled on the rooftop of his palace. From that vantage point, he saw a woman named Bathsheba bathing, a moment of beauty twisted into temptation. What David saw wasn't the problem, it was what he did next. Instead of turning away, he lingered. Desire took root where discipline should have been. And isn't that how sin often starts? Not with a loud declaration, but a quiet compromise, entertaining a thought, justifying a glance, telling yourself it's harmless. But unchecked, those moments gain power. David, a man who once stood against giants, now faced a battle within. Bathsheba wasn't just a woman, she was the wife of Uriah, one of David's most loyal soldiers. Yet, despite knowing this, David sent messengers to bring her to the palace. This wasn't romance, it was a misuse of power, a king acting out of unchecked desire. Think about it. How often do people justify actions because of their position or influence, forgetting the responsibility that comes with leadership? This wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was a choice, premeditated and deliberate. David had countless options to turn back, yet he crossed the line. The gravity of his sin deepened when Bathsheba became pregnant. Suddenly, the consequences were undeniable. But instead of owning his mistake, David sought to cover it up, setting off a chain of deception. How often do we try to hide our wrongs, hoping they'll disappear instead of facing them head-on? Temptation rarely presents itself as destructive at first. For David, it began with an evening stroll, a glance, a lingering thought. If you've ever faced moments of personal temptation, whether in relationships, finances, or integrity, it often starts small. But one compromise can spiral, leading to consequences far beyond what you imagined. The danger lies in believing you're in control when the truth is, sin always demands more than you expect. What makes this moment so tragic is that David, a man after God's own heart, had all the tools to resist. He had experienced God's power, heard his voice, written songs of praise, and yet, in a moment of idleness, he chose self over surrender. No one, no matter how spiritual, is immune to the danger of unchecked desires. David's actions teach a sobering truth. Even the most faithful can fall when they lose focus. He let his position create distance between himself and accountability. The higher you rise, the more critical it is to stay grounded in truth. So, what safeguards have you placed in your life to stay anchored when temptation calls? But David's story doesn't end here. The consequences were far from over. The cover-up would grow darker, and the cost would be higher than he ever anticipated. After Bathsheba revealed her pregnancy, David's initial response wasn't repentance. It was damage control. Fear of exposure often tempts us to cover our tracks instead of confronting the truth. David, a king with vast influence, summoned Uriah back from battle, hoping the soldier would sleep with his wife and the pregnancy would be seen as his. It was a desperate attempt to rewrite reality. But integrity cannot be manipulated. It will demand the truth eventually. Uriah, however, was a man of honor. While his comrades fought on the battlefield, he refused the comforts of home, even when the king himself encouraged it. His loyalty exposed a sharp contrast to David's deception. Can you imagine the tension? A righteous soldier standing unknowingly before a compromised king. It's a reminder that personal integrity isn't about position, but the choices made in private moments. When his plan failed, David's desperation grew darker. Sin has a way of compounding, doesn't it? One poor choice leads to another, and before you know it, you're deeper than you ever intended. Instead of confessing, David wrote a message, sealed with the king's own authority, ordering Uriah's death on the battlefield. And the irony, he sent it in Uriah's own hands, trusting his loyalty to deliver his own death sentence. Think about this. How often do people sacrifice relationships, careers, even faith, just to protect an image? David's spiral wasn't just personal, it was systemic. His leadership, once defined by courage and faith, was now corrupted by deceit. Covering sin always costs more than confessing it. The question is, will we learn from his mistake or repeat it in our own way? Uriah's death wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the fallout. After his passing, David took Bathsheba as his wife, believing he had successfully hidden his sin. On the surface, the problem seemed resolved. Yet, unresolved guilt lingers, festering beneath the surface. Even when others can't see the truth, the weight of hidden sin clings to the soul. Have you ever tried to move forward while carrying unresolved mistakes? It's exhausting and unsustainable. The consequences of David's actions weren't limited to his own heart. His choices sent ripples through his entire household. What began as a private failure led to public tragedy. And isn't that the truth? Sin never just affects the one who commits it. Families break, trust shatters, and the impact can echo for generations. David's fall reminds us that even the most faithful can lose their way. But it also reveals something even deeper, how far someone can drift when accountability is missing. No one is immune. What safeguards do you have in place to ensure your heart stays aligned with truth? Real strength isn't avoiding mistakes altogether. It's having the courage to face them when they happen. But David's reckoning wasn't over. His sin would be confronted, not by armies or scandals, but by a single voice, carrying a truth he could no longer deny. David's betrayal of Uriah was calculated, cold, and devastating. When the king realized Uriah's integrity couldn't be swayed, He orchestrated his murder, sending orders to Joab, his military commander, to place Uriah on the front lines where the battle was fiercest. It wasn't just a strategic decision. It was a deliberate act to silence his conscience and erase the evidence of his sin. But as we often see, trying to cover sin only deepens the damage. Joab, following David's command, carried out the plan without question. Uriah, a loyal soldier who had risked his life for Israel countless times, was left vulnerable in battle. His death wasn't a casualty of war. It was murder disguised as military strategy. And yet, how often do people justify wrongdoing under the guise of necessity? David wasn't just betraying Uriah. He was betraying his calling, his character, and his relationship with God. After Uriah's death, David quickly took Bathsheba as his wife, thinking he had successfully covered his tracks. On the surface, life moved forward. No public scandal, no questions. But unresolved sin lingers, doesn't it? What he thought was buried was, in reality, a growing fracture in his soul. Sin may be hidden from human eyes, but it cannot be hidden from God. The weight of David's actions stretched far beyond the battlefield. His household began to reflect the very chaos he had tried to suppress. When we compromise our integrity, it doesn't just affect us, it ripples through our families, communities, and legacies. The unaddressed pain and guilt created an invisible wedge between David and his faith. How often do we carry silent guilt, convincing ourselves the damage isn't visible, while it quietly distorts our hearts? What makes this betrayal even more tragic is that Uriah was everything David had once been: faithful, courageous, selfless. David's failure wasn't just moral, it was personal. He betrayed not just a soldier, but a reflection of his former self. Have you ever faced a moment where you realized you drifted far from who you once were? That's the sting of compromised integrity. It distorts our identity. The irony is that David, a man who had once trusted God with his battles, was now fighting his own moral decay. And it started with unchecked thoughts, unaddressed desires, and the illusion of control. How often do we think we can manage the fallout of our decisions, only to find the consequences spiraling far beyond our reach? Yet, even in this darkness, a reckoning was coming. God wasn't finished with David. His fall was great, but grace was greater. Someone would soon enter David's life, not to punish him but to confront him with truth. And that truth would pierce deeper than any battlefield wound. David thought his secret was safe. He believed he had successfully buried his sin beneath royal authority and public appearances. But God saw it all. And when God calls someone to repentance, he often sends a voice, not thunder from the heavens, but a messenger of truth. Enter Nathan, a prophet not there to condemn, but to awaken a sleeping conscience. Nathan didn't confront David with direct accusations. He used a parable, an ancient teaching method designed to bypass defenses and strike the heart. He told of a rich man who stole a poor man's only lamb, a lamb the poor man had raised with love. David, hearing the injustice, burned with anger, declaring the rich man deserved death. Only then did Nathan deliver the piercing truth: "You are that man." Imagine the silence in that moment, the weight of conviction crashing down, the sudden realization of being fully exposed. How often do we fail to recognize our own flaws while harshly judging the failures of others? David's outrage at the fictional injustice reflected his blindness to his own heart. Truth has a way of cutting through self-deception like a blade. Nathan's confrontation wasn't just about sin, it was about accountability. God wasn't finished with David, but healing couldn't begin without truth. And here's the sobering reality. David's sin was forgiven, but it wasn't without consequence. Nathan delivered a prophecy of turmoil. His household would face unrest, betrayal, and the loss of the child conceived from his sin. A harsh reminder that forgiveness erases guilt, but often leaves scars. This moment reveals a powerful truth. God disciplines those he loves. Nathan wasn't sent to destroy David, but to restore him, to call him back to his identity as a man after God's heart. Sometimes, the most loving thing God can do is expose our failures, not to humiliate us, but to lead us back to healing. Have you ever had someone confront you with painful truth? It's uncomfortable, but necessary for growth. David's response was pivotal. He didn't justify or defend his actions. He didn't shift blame or seek to silence Nathan. Instead, he uttered the words that mark true repentance. "I have sinned against the Lord." Genuine repentance isn't about managing appearances. It's about humbling the heart before God. David was broken, not just because he got caught, but because he finally saw the gravity of his sin. Yet even in his brokenness, there was hope. Nathan assured him, "The Lord has taken away your sin." This wasn't cheap grace. It was costly, painful, and yet redemptive. God's mercy was present, even in the midst of discipline, but the consequences were far from over. The next chapter in David's life would be marked by loss and turmoil as the ripple effect of his choices unfolded. David's confrontation teaches us that truth, while painful, is a gift. Ignoring sin only deepens its grip. But when truth is spoken in love, it has the power to break chains and restore the soul. David's repentance was raw, sincere, and deeply emotional. When Nathan exposed his sin, David didn't offer excuses or self-justification. He fell to his knees in brokenness, fully aware of the weight of his actions. His words in Psalm 51 reveal the depth of his heart. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." This wasn't shallow regret. It was the kind of sorrow that leads to genuine transformation. True repentance isn't just about words, it's about a shift in the heart. David wasn't merely sorry he got caught. He was grieved that he had sinned against God. This distinction matters. How often do people apologize just to ease the consequences, not out of a sincere desire for change? David's plea for a clean heart showed he wasn't asking for a reset. He was asking for spiritual renewal. But repentance, though genuine, didn't erase the consequences. The child conceived with Bathsheba fell gravely ill. David fasted, prayed, and wept, pleading for the child's life. Yet despite his prayers, the child died. It's a difficult truth, but sin often carries consequences that linger even after forgiveness. And here's the challenge. How do we hold on to faith when our past choices lead to painful outcomes? When the child passed, David did something unexpected. He rose from his mourning, washed, and went to worship. His servants were confused. Why worship after such heartbreak? David's answer was profound. "I will go to him, but he will not return to me." This revealed a spiritual maturity few possess, trusting God even when the outcome wasn't what he wanted. It's a reminder that faith isn't about manipulating results. It's about surrendering to God's will, even when it hurts. Yet the aftermath of David's sin extended beyond personal loss. His household spiraled into chaos. His son Amnon committed a grievous sin against his sister Tamar, an event that fractured the family even further. Absalom, David's other son, burned with rage and ultimately sought revenge, setting off a chain of rebellion that would tear the kingdom apart. David's moral failure didn't just affect him, it weakened the moral fabric of his entire household. This sobering reality reminds us that unchecked sin can ripple across generations. Leadership, whether in a family, a business, or a community, carries a weight. When integrity is compromised, it leaves a void where chaos can take root. David's example forces us to ask, are we living in a way that strengthens or fractures the people entrusted to us? Yet even in this storm, David never abandoned his relationship with God. He continued to seek the Lord, to write psalms of praise and repentance, and to point his people back to the truth of God's mercy. His life was marked by both failure and faith, a paradox that reminds us redemption is possible, even for the fallen. David's story doesn't end in tragedy but transformation. Though his family bore the scars of his failure, his heart remained anchored in God. And through his lineage, the ultimate Redeemer, Jesus Christ, would one day be born, a powerful testament that God can bring beauty from brokenness. David's story isn't just a historical account. It's a powerful mirror reflecting the struggles we all face. His fall teaches a sobering truth. Unchecked desires, when ignored, can destroy even the strongest among us. But his journey doesn't end with failure. It reveals something even greater, the power of genuine repentance and how God can restore even the most broken hearts. The real question is, what do you do when confronted with your own mistakes? Do you cover them up, hoping they'll disappear? Or do you have the courage to face the truth, like David did? His life reminds us that no failure is beyond redemption when there's sincere repentance. But it also warns us that unaddressed sin leaves a trail of pain far beyond ourselves. So, where do you stand today? Are there areas in your life that need the light of truth? Maybe it's time to confront those hidden struggles, to stop running from conviction and start running toward restoration. Because the same God who restored David is ready to restore you, if you're willing to take that step. If this message spoke to you, I encourage you to reflect on David's journey and don't keep these insights to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments. How has this story challenged your perspective on sin, accountability, and redemption? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss more powerful teachings like this one. Together, let's continue growing in faith, wisdom, and truth.